Romans 8:7. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. So in Romans 8:7, we have this continued conversation about the characteristics of the flesh. And in Romans 8:5, we see that those who live according to the flesh, that is the sinful nature that we're born into this world with, set their mind on those things. So their desires, their passions, their motives are all driven by their sinful nature. Romans 8:6, we see that our setting our minds on the flesh, on the sinful nature, leads to death. And we said that that includes both physical death and spiritual death, eternity in hell, separation from God. In Romans 8:7, we see that the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. In other words, the attitude of an individual whose mind is set on the flesh is against God. The posture of the person whose mind is set on the flesh is against God. It's not an attitude or posture of submission, but it's an attitude or posture of enmity, of hostility. Romans 5:10 says that while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son. The reason it uses that word enemies to describe us before coming to Christ is because of our hostility in the flesh towards God. So this hostility towards God in posture and attitude is described back by a lack of submission to God's law. And remember, earlier in Romans 8, we talked about the summation of God's law by Jesus in Matthew 22. He said that all of God's law and the prophets can be summed up by loving God and loving people. And in Romans 13, Paul says that love fulfills the law. So when we talk about a lack of submission to God's law, we're talking about a lack of loving God and a lack of loving people. Often we think of hostility as like an active hate, but we need to think of hostility and enmity towards God, yes, as an active hate towards God, but also as just a complete lack of submission to God's law. So think about a disrespectful child in the classroom. A teacher who has a child in his or her classroom who just disregards everything that they say and does not submit to them as their teacher, that teacher may describe that child as hostile towards them. Not because they're actively trying to hurt them, but because they're actively not submitting to their authority. So we kind of need to frame our hostility to God as not simply an act of hate towards him, but an active lack of submission to him. And this lack of submission to his law, and remember, his law is summed up by Jesus in Matthew 22, loving God, loving people. And again in Romans 13, Paul says, love fulfills the law. So a lack of submission to his law is a lack of loving God and a lack of loving people. So two examples we might think of. A man who worships his business life, who is a workaholic, who winds up not loving his family as well as he should because of his work habits. He is hostile towards God. And a man who commits adultery, who cheats on his wife, who chooses not to love his wife, is hostile, not submitting to God's law, to love God and to love his wife as himself. He's hostile towards God. So two totally different sins, but both resulting in a lack of submission and a presence of hostility, a hostile posture or attitude towards God. Now we see in Romans 8:7 that the mind that is set on the flesh is not only hostile towards God, but it lacks the very ability to to obey God's law. And that leads us to Romans 8:8.